Right, let me just bring you breaking news on the British student Matthew Hedges. He has been found guilty by a court in the United Arab Emirates of spying for the British government. He's a specialist in Middle Eastern studies at Durham University. He was detained at Dubai airport on the 5th of May as he was leaving the country following a research trip. We have just had the news confirmed by the Foreign Secretary Jeremy Hunt, who has put out a statement saying that Matthew Hedges has been sentenced to life in prison in the UAE on charges of spying for the UK. The Foreign Secretary says he's deeply shocked and disappointed by that verdict. He says, "I have personally raised the case of Matthew Hedges at the highest levels of the UAE government, including during my visit to Abu Dhabi on the 12th of November. On that occasion, I spoke to Crown Prince Mohammed bin Zayed and Foreign Minister Abdullah bin Zayed. However, today's verdict is not what we expect from a friend and trusted partner of the United Kingdom, and it runs contrary to earlier assurances. Our consular officials have been in close contact with Matthew Hedges and his family. We will continue to do everything possible to support him. I have repeatedly made clear that the handling of this case by the UAE authorities will have repercussions for the relationship between our two countries, which has to be built on trust. I regret the fact that we have reached this position, and I urge the UAE to reconsider." So Jeremy Hunt putting out that statement, quite a strong statement. He did raise it in a trip to Abu Dhabi earlier this month, but that news just through now that Matthew Hedges has been sentenced to life in prison. We will bring you reaction to that sentencing as soon as we can. Thank you very much. Let's go back to the breaking news this hour, the news that a court in the UAE has sentenced the British student Matthew Hedges to life in prison after he was charged with spying last month. The Foreign Secretary Jeremy Hunt has released a statement. He said, "I am deeply shocked and disappointed by the verdict today. I have personally raised the case of Matthew Hedges at the highest levels of the UAE government, including during my visit to Abu Dhabi on the 12th of November. On that occasion, I spoke to Crown Prince Mohammed bin Zayed and Foreign Minister Abdullah bin Zayed. However, today's verdict is not what we expect from a friend and trusted partner of the UK and runs contrary to earlier assurances. I have repeatedly made clear that the handling of this case by the UAE authorities will have repercussions for the relationship between our two countries, which has to be built on trust. I regret the fact that we have reached this position, and I urge the UAE to reconsider." We can speak to Cinzia Bianco, a friend of Matthew Hedges. She joins us via webcam from North London. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm very sorry that obviously you've had to be dealing with this verdict. What is your reaction to it?
I mean, we are all shocked because, in fact, what this verdict says is that there is no boundaries, there is no there is no safety for academic research in the UAE, and it's quite astonishing because the UAE has tried to build itself and its profile internationally, including by inviting campuses of prestigious international universities who are currently operating in the UAE. And what does this say for how does it feature into the verdict today?
When he was released on bail, did you take that as a good sign?
Yes, of course, it was a good sign, but it was also clear that it was due to the pressure that the UAE authorities had received, including by the international media and the press. So as long as the case was kept secret, so to speak, or confidential, he received treatment that has been described as beyond the international standards and below the international standards by several associations. So then, thanks to this pressure, he was released on bail, and there were expectations that the pressure and added to the actions of the UK government would have led to a different verdict. Now we have seen that yesterday President Trump's reaction to the Khashoggi killing, the first official statement by the White House, has actually opened up perhaps a cane of impunity for this kind of authoritarian measures. The
Foreign Secretary has put out a statement saying he is very disappointed. he raised this issue directly with the authorities in Abu Dhabi. What will the next step be by Matthew Hedges' supporters?
Well, this is has a lot to do with what kind of reactions actual actions we will see from the UK and especially also from Europe, because Matthew Hedges is a European Union citizen as well. So we are expecting more repercussions and more and stronger positions, because the UK and the UAE have been continuing to have joint projects and delegations in these past weeks.
I spoke to his partner. She was very strong. Obviously, it is going to be very difficult for everyone to deal with it. Have you been able to speak to Daniela Tejada or any other family members since this verdict came through?
Not yet. We are leaving them some space, because I mean they are shocked as well. They weren't expecting this verdict, but they are. Of course, they have 30 days to appeal to this verdict, and there is still a glimmer of hope, and that should be said.
Okay, well, thank you very much for joining us, Cinzia Bianco, friend of Matthew Hedges. We can talk with our diplomatic correspondent, Paul Adams, who's joined me in the studio. So, Paul, this seems sudden, and there's obviously been a shock to his family, also the Foreign Secretary who had raised the issue.
A shock to absolutely everyone. I was confidently expecting that we would hear some good news today, because all the indications through private channels and things that I understood that the family had been hearing, that the Foreign Office had been hearing, that MPs had been hearing, was that the United Arab Emirates were frankly a little embarrassed about this case and wanted it over with. So no one was expecting a sentence of life imprisonment. That has absolutely stunned everyone. I think the tenor of the Foreign Secretary's statement is pretty telling, not what we expect from a friend and trusted partner. There's a sense in which Jeremy Hunt is really saying that I have been personally betrayed and let down. He said, I spoke to the Crown Prince and the Foreign Minister about this case, and he's urging the UAE to reconsider and saying that there will be repercussions for the relationship between the two countries if that does not happen. So clearly the Foreign Office is very much taken aback. I should say that in terms of glimmers of hope, we've been looking at and trying to make sense of a couple of tweets from a local newspaper which seemed to give a slightly longer version of what was announced in a 5-minute hearing this morning. Yes, on the one hand, saying that a sentence of life has been handed down to Matthew Hedges, but also saying that the court ruling, and I'm quoting here a translation that we've had done by our colleagues at BBC Monitoring, the court ruling stipulated that Hedges should leave the country after the sentence is carried out. He was also ordered to pay for the expenses of the court case. The court also ordered the confiscation of all items confiscated during his arrest, and says that Mr. Hedges, has a maximum of 30 days to appeal. Now, obviously, leaving the country after a life sentence is not clearly what they mean. Does this mean that they are going to deport him in the wake of this sentence? I think at the moment we simply do not know exactly what is going on. I think it is possible that, having been seen to carry out justice as they would see it, they may now be wanting to get rid of him.
OK, we will continue to watch and wait. Thank you very much, Paul. She also actually referred to the situation with Matthew Hedges, the British student who this morning has been sentenced to life in prison in the United Arab Emirates for spying. The 31-year-old, who's always maintained his innocence, had been researching the country's foreign and internal security policies when he was detained by the authorities in May. The issue was raised in the Commons, and Theresa May responded by saying the Foreign Office is remaining in close contact with Matthew Hedges' wife and family and will continue to represent him at the highest levels. We've actually now had a statement through from Matthew Hedges' wife, Daniela Tejada. She has said Matthew is innocent. The Foreign Office know this and have made it clear to the UAE authorities that Matthew is not a spy for them. This whole case has been handled appallingly from the very beginning, with no one taking Matthew's case seriously. The British government must take a stand now for Matthew, one of their citizens. They say the UAE is an ally, but the overwhelmingly arbitrary handling of Matt's case indicates a scarily different reality for which Matt and I are being made to pay a devastatingly high price. This has been the worst 6 months of my life, let alone for Matt, who was shaking when he heard the verdict. The UAE authorities should feel ashamed for such an obvious injustice. Well, let's get more from our reporter Paul Blake, who joins us from Dubai. Paul, this seemed to come from absolutely nowhere. He was previously out on bail. This was just a 5-minute hearing, and there's been shock at the outcome, the fact he has been sentenced to life.
That's right. I mean, the hearing was this morning at 10 a.m. and the family says that it lasted just 5 minutes and that his lawyer was not present. Now, that's details coming from a spokesperson for the family. And let's back up a little bit and remember a few details about this case. Matthew Hedges is an academic at Durham University in the UK. He was here for a reporting trip during the spring, and he was attempting to leave the country via the Dubai airport on May 5th when he was detained. You know, we didn't hear anything about this case until October, when it really kind of poured out into the press. And at that time, the family and fellow academics started raising concerns about Matthew Hedges' treatment here, saying that he was being held in solitary confinement and that he was not having consular access. And they've reiterated a bit of that in their statement today, the family via that spokesperson. They said that during his first 6 weeks of detention, Matthew was interrogated without a lawyer or consular access, and he was held in solitary confinement. He said that he was made to sign a document in Arabic, a language that he doesn't speak or read, which they said they later found out was a confession, and that during that time he was fed a cocktail of medication by prison guards, including Xanax, Valium, and Ritalin. Now, these are all details and allegations being made by the family spokesperson about his case. That case was decided just this morning, and the family says that they're unsure where he is going or what will happen now.
Thank you very much, Paul.
And John is here with me now, and there does seem to be widespread shock at this sentence.
Well, obviously shock from the family, from his wife, as we heard there, but also I think from the government too. Theresa May mentioned that the Foreign Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, had been in Abu Dhabi less than 2 weeks ago. He'd had very high-level meetings with the Crown Prince, with the Foreign Minister, and I think the feeling really was from government officials here that he was probably going to be released. He had been out on bail. We hear from the family today the hearing lasted just 5 minutes without a lawyer present, according to the family. He's now facing life in prison.
And is there any choice of appeal?
Well, we understand that there is an option to appeal. They have to appeal within 30 days. That's what's being reported within some of the local media there. The family are obviously going to be considering their options, and as we heard from Theresa May in that piece, they are going to be renewing their pressure on the authorities in the UAE.
Now, concern about his physical and mental health. What sort of conditions do we think he's going to be in?
Well, I actually interviewed Daniela, his wife, just a couple of weeks ago, and she said at the initial part of his detention, he'd been held in solitary confinement for a long time. She said he was vomiting every day just from the anxiety and stress. She says he does suffer very much from anxiety. I think those conditions has eased, but I think what she felt at the time was certainly that the government had put quite a lot of pressure on the UAE authorities about the conditions and making those conditions a little bit easier in detention, but not enough just questioning the actual charges. He, of course, says he was there doing research. He was looking into the impact of the Arab Spring on some of the Gulf kingdoms. He certainly denies that he was spying.
Well, the allegation is that he is a British spy. Do we know the strength of these accusations?
We don't really. We hear from his wife that initially at the beginning of his detention he was asked to sign a statement that was in Arabic without his lawyer present apparently, and that this turned out to be a confession. So he admitted to spying in this statement, but he didn't know what he was saying. So we don't know the strength of the allegations. What we do know, PhD student writing his thesis at Durham University, as I say, into the impact of the Arab Spring on security policy in some of the Gulf states. Now, he was picked up beginning of May as he tried to leave Dubai, having been there, I think, for about 10 days carrying out research. He certainly denies being a spy.
John, thank you very much. John Thomas. Let's get more now on the news that the British academic Matthew Hedges has been sentenced to life in prison in the United Arab Emirates for spying. The 31-year-old, who's always maintained his innocence, had been researching the country's foreign and internal security policies when he was detained by authorities in May. We can speak now to the Conservative MP Bob Seely, who sits on the House of Commons Foreign Select Committee. Joins me now from Westminster. Good afternoon to you.
Hello.
The Foreign Office seems to have been caught wrong-footed on this. This has come as a surprise.
I think it probably. I think the sentence comes as a surprise, and clearly we all hope that it is going to be rescinded, or that he will be allowed to leave the country, or there will be some kind of settlement soon in the next 30 days or so. But yes, it seems to have come as a bit of a surprise. Certainly the severity of the sentence.
What do you want the Emirati authorities to do?
Right. They need to remember who their friends and allies are, and if we have a defence agreement with them, then they shouldn't be arresting and imprisoning British citizens without good reason, and there doesn't seem to be good reason here. Clearly, the UAE has sensitivities, and clearly the Gulf is a more sensitive place than it was a few years ago, with the Saudi-Iran dynamic, with Mr. Hedges looking into tribal issues, the Yemeni civil war, and Arab Spring. And if you look at his Twitter feed, there were lots of remarks in that space, and clearly he has upset and offended the UAE authorities. That is no reason for them to behave in the way that they've done so.
Nevertheless, would you suggest to others considering doing similar work perhaps to think again?
Well, it's a shame, and they shouldn't have to, but they probably will, and considering what has happened with Mr. Hedges, I suspect it's wise. I think the UAE is sending a very clear message that they don't like people looking into areas that they consider to be sensitive. It's a shame they're doing that, and it's a great shame they're trying to make an example of a British citizen.
Jeremy Hunt, under some pressure over this,
Yeah.
looking on as Theresa May was making the statement during Prime Minister's questions, what should he do?
As forcefully as possible, he should be reminding the UAE who their friends and allies are in the wider world, and the very strong links between the UAE and Britain, and this shouldn't be happening.
But do you think he should be going out there?
If need be, yes, certainly a minister should be, if we think it can help. But it's early days yet, and I'm sure he is working very hard. I know that Jeremy Hunt is a highly competent individual and a very good Foreign Secretary, and I'm sure that he will be doing his best to get a resolution to this very quickly.
Bob Seely, thanks so much for your time this afternoon.
Thank you.
Well, let's speak now to Matthew Hedges MP, Ben Bradshaw. He's in our Westminster studio. Thanks for joining us. This seems to have caught everybody on the hop.
Yes, I think after Matthew was released after 5 months in solitary confinement about 2 weeks ago, we all hoped that was a good sign, and certainly from the discussions I had with the Emirati ambassador here, and obviously from the discussions that the Foreign Secretary had with his counterparts, I think people had become hopeful. Daniela herself had flown out there to be with him. She'd become hopeful, and this has come as a devastating blow. It's an appalling and really very shocking verdict.
So how to get him out?
Well, I thought the statement put out by Jeremy Hunt, the Foreign Secretary, was very interesting because it was quite a strong statement. And it was the first time, really, that the British government has accepted that repercussions will have to follow if Matthew is not released. I think they've been trying to do their best behind the scenes, using the usual softly approach that British governments adopt with these Gulf countries when things like this happen. But I think they've reached the end of the road with that, and we have enormous influence and economic, military, cultural, educational ties with the UAE, and the government now needs to use those, needs to explain what actions are going to follow the Foreign Secretary's strong words.
Have you had any contact with his wife, his family in the previous weeks?
I've been in touch with Daniela all the way through since Matthew was first arrested. The whole issue was kept under wraps for several weeks, months, on the advice of the Foreign Office. I think Daniela reached the stage. Matthew was very ill. He wasn't being properly treated. He had no access to medical treatment or reading. He was in solitary confinement, and I think basically she lost her patience, and the issue became public. It was only after that, incidentally, that he was released from solitary confinement. But this is clearly a very serious step backwards. Daniela is on her way back to the UK now. She's been with Matthew over the last 2 weeks looking after him, but clearly I haven't had a chance to speak to her because she's in the air, but I will endeavour to do so, and I'll be speaking to the Foreign Office Minister Alistair Burt later this afternoon.
A question I ought to ask, I mean, whenever we talk about a Briton who's jailed abroad, the assumption is always that they are innocent. Is there any doubt in anybody's mind that he wasn't doing anything other than what he said, which is research?
research? No, certainly not in mine, nor in Durham University's, nor in Daniela's. He was in there in the UAE for 10 days, quite openly, going around doing his research, and was only arrested as he was leaving at the airport. And the British government themselves have made absolutely clear to the Emirati authorities that he was not a British spy, and I don't think they can say any more than that. These are trumped up charges. He may have been being naive in terms of the subject matter he was looking into, but look, we have a great tradition in this country of academic freedom, and just because he was researching how the authorities there responded to the Arab Spring is not justification for incarcerating an innocent British man for life for doing academic research.
Ben Bradshaw, thank you very much for your time this afternoon. Thanks for joining us. Well, I can speak now to Dr. John Nagle. He's a sociological researcher from the University of Aberdeen. He's written about his own experience of academia and the restrictions placed upon it in the United Arab Emirates. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. Just reading what you wrote in The Independent, and you basically said, I'm not surprised he was arrested. I've seen the country's frightening lack of academic freedom with my own eyes. In what way?
Well, there's many kind of different ways in which the UAE system impinges upon academics. As soon as I arrived in the UAE, it was very clear to me about the boundaries which are placed on academics. There's very few things which you can do research on. There's very few things in which you're allowed to teach on. There's quite a few numerous examples of academics working in UAE universities who've been arrested for human rights activism. There's even examples of academics working on the American New York University Abu Dhabi campus who've been penalised for doing research on issues to do with migrant workers in the UAE, and also kind of talking very generally about the UAE's position politically in the Middle East at the moment. So it's a very sort of problematic issue for anybody doing research in the UAE.
Well, which raises the question, why do you go there to do research if that's the sort of constraints that are going to be on you?
Well, I think academics do kind of research in a number of different places in which there are kind of constraints, and it's important for us to kind of engage with the dynamics and kind of processes and political events which occur in these societies. You know, that's what academics do. You know, however, at the same time, we need to be mindful of issues to do with our own kind of personal safety and the safety of others.
So was Matthew guilty of anything? He was guilty of naivety?
Well, I mean, it's very kind of hard to tell with Matthew Hedges. He was doing research which had been very clearly been given a green light by the University of Durham. It passed all of our kind of ethical requirements. He was seen to be doing research on a safe subject. However, the Middle East is actually a very kind of politically volatile region at the moment, and you know, the situation can change very quickly. So it seems as if Matthew Hedges was unfortunately just got himself into a situation where he just found himself on the wrong line of what's permissible in terms of doing research in the UAE.
So Western institutions perhaps need to rethink how they treat the UAE in future, and I suspect that will already be happening given what's happened to him.
I think researchers and universities will need to be very clear in terms of the guidelines which will be given to PhD students and researchers more generally about going to the UAE. There's also another really important issue, which is about UK universities building campuses and institutional links in places like the UAE and the Qatar, because it's not only to do with the type of research which we do in these campuses, but there's issues about personal safety, about the human rights being guaranteed of many of the people who are going to work in these places. So, for example, members of the LGBTQ population have voiced some degree of worry about the status and safety of members of that particular population doing research and working on these campuses.
John, it's very good to talk to us. John Nagle, thank you very much for your time.
No problem. Thank you.
Now, let's. I just want to read some breaking news on our main story. This is the imprisonment for life of Matthew Hedges in the United Arab Emirates. The Foreign Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, has just tweeted in the last few minutes. He says, the news on Matthew Hedges is extremely worrying. We've seen no evidence to back up the charges against him. These are charges of spying. The FCO, that's the Foreign and Commonwealth Office to you and me, will do all we can to get him home, and I will meet his wife Daniela tomorrow. UAE claimed to be friend and ally of the UK, so there will be serious diplomatic consequences, and he just used that one word, unacceptable. So ratcheting up the pressure on the diplomatic front there from the Foreign Secretary. Will keep you in touch with any more developments on that. Well, in the last hour, one of Matthew Hedges' colleagues at Durham University has been giving his reaction to Hedges' sentence.
I'm appalled. It's been just a desperate time for, obviously mostly for Matt and for his family, but especially his wife Danny. Sending the email to my colleagues confirming that this is what had happened is one of the hardest things I've done in my 17 years here at the university. It's a conviction that is unjust and a sentence that is just outrageous.
His wife today saying that she's very concerned for his welfare, knowing him as you do. How do you think he's at the moment?
Well, Matt, I can't begin to think what must be going through Matt's mind. I mean, one of the things that we know from was that Matt was, he was not well. His mental health was not good during his period of detention. We understand that he was on suicide watch for parts of that time, and clearly we're desperately worried about what this might do to his well-being and the possibility of any benefits he's had in any gains he's made in his health in the period he's been on bail will be wiped out overnight by this.
Explain to us specifically why he was there in the first place, what the basis of his research was.
So Matt's research is into developments within the United Arab Emirates in terms of how its foreign and security and defence policies have been developing, particularly since 2011. There's a lot of academic work into this field because how the Gulf monarchies, such as the UAE or Bahrain or Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, the others, have developed since the Arab Spring is something that's very important. It's something that's very interesting, and so Matt was coming towards the end of his PhD. He'd done a great deal of open source work using the existing published literature, looking at the news coverage of these fields in that area, collating that information together. So he was out there looking to interview a number of people who he had previously identified and who he had made contact with, just to get their particular insider perspectives upon the developments within the country.
What kind of people?
So it's a bit of a mixture. So some would be international experts currently based in the UAE. Some would be former UAE government officials who had worked in relevant areas and who were known to have inside information and understanding about how it is that these processes operate, just to get a perspective upon whether the published literature was getting this right, or whether there were particular other issues or insights that you can gain from talking to people who've been directly involved in these activities.
Our correspondent Paul Adams is here. The Foreign Secretary said he was shocked at the verdict. What implications could this have for relations between the UK and the UAE?
I think it's fair to say that Jeremy Hunt was furious about this, and he's not a man who's given to displays of fury. He thinks, essentially, that he was given an indication, almost an assurance, during his personal intervention, that this would not be the outcome and that Matthew Hedges would be released. He has talked about there being consequences. What might those be? Well, it's a very close relationship. 6,000 British businesses based in the UAE, 100,000 British citizens living and working there, 1 million tourists visit every year. But I think before we get into what the consequences might be, there's probably a bit of the legal process that needs to play out. The Attorney General in the UAE has said that this is not the final verdict, that Matthew Hedges, who he said made a confession, a full confession of the crimes he is alleged to have committed, can appeal. There can be a retrial in which he and his lawyer can both be reheard. So that process could happen. It could happen relatively quickly. We simply don't know. I think the hope here is that the UAE will be taken aback by the strength of the British response. They don't want to be seen, frankly, as behaving like Iran in the case of Nazanin Zaghari Ratcliffe. It's just very, very bad publicity for them. So perhaps they might want to see a way out of this. But I think the family is probably asking, with an accusing finger at the Foreign Office, how did it get this far?
Paul Adams, thank you.